PokeClass is sponsored by CollectorsCash.com, who now have your new set next Destinies in stock at amazing prices. Get your boxes, sealed products and single cards like Mewtwo EX for the most competitive prices around, as well as all of your current format goodies within easy reach. If you're looking to stock up on anything Pokemon or any other card game for that matter, then head over to CollectorsCash.com after the show. So the Saturday just gone, I attended the cities over here in the UK with next Destinies being legal, and this is all that I could hear. So yeah, I will attach my double colourless to Mewtwo and X-Ball for KO. For my turn, I'll use Dynamotor to attach lightning energy to my benched Mewtwo, and I will treat my free retreat Dynamo and X-Ball for KO. So I'll bench my Shaman, use Celebration Wind to move the 2 energy off of my Celebi EX onto my Mewtwo, and then I'll use X-Ball for KO. X-Ball for KO was a phrase many players were hearing and saying to one another all day, right up until the finals game. And why? Because Mewtwo is so damn versatile that every single deck can play it. The double colourless it takes to power up X-Ball can be covered in many ways: Typhlosion, Electric and even Patricia and Shaman, but today we're going to look into its green counterpart, Celebi. Celebi Mewtwo has proven itself already, taking the topmost place in the biggest tournament in Europe, the EXTC, just last week. Celebi has been with us since Triumphant and has always had an interesting poker power, but hasn't made much sense at all since there was no way to constantly retreat the little guy after using the power, unless you used it on Celebi itself, which is obviously counterproductive. However, this card, Skyra Bridge, has brought it into its own by being able to use Celebi's poker power, retreat it to the bench for free and reap the benefits. So let's have a look at the deck that has slowly been given the title of one of the fastest decks in the format. First off, we've been talking about Celebi's poker power already, but what does it do? Forest Breath is simple and allows you to attach a grass energy from your hand onto one of your Pokemon on the field as long as Celebi is active. Now that the clause at the end has been made much easier to get around, as mentioned just now, it has become the perfect partner for none other than Mewtwo EX, a Pokemon that loves to suck up energy and use it to deal 20s of damage because of it. But now it can easily deal 60 damage before your opponent has even gotten a turn, and quite consistently at that. But it's not only Mewtwo that has been invited to the forest, since we have another attacker in the format which can also attack with 3 energy in a single turn, but for 20 more damage than Mewtwo can, and that's Tornadus. This Pokemon is already very familiar with the idea of donking, being part of ZPST, and using Hurricane on turn 1 through Patricia and Shaman. However, Celebi gives another option to be using Hurricane on your first turn. If you start Celebi and have double colourless, grass energy, a way to grab Tornadus and a way to retreat Celebi in your hand, you'll be good to go with 80 damage on your first turn. Now, I know that does sound like a lot to get on the first turn, but when you use it with Dual Ball, leaving your supporter open for the turn, you should be in good standing. You only need 1 heads on Dual Ball to grab those Pokemon you need rather than the 2 ZPST might need, and then you can use cards such as Professor Juniper and Pon to grab the final pieces of the puzzle. If the turn 1 doesn't happen for Tornadus, then Mewtwo only needs a double colourless to hit for 40 anyway, a very nice amount of damage with all those Dynamos around. And to be honest, that's pretty much what the deck does. It hits hard and fast, but it also has a variety of tech options that can be easily squeezed in an already extremely consistent deck. Let's have a look at a quick skeleton and go over some of the deck choices. The obvious start is to have 4 Celebi Prime. It's your main starter and allows you to attach extra energy in your initial turns. Even if you can't get the donk on your opponent, at least you get those extra attachments. Nothing less than 4 would be advisable simply because you need a fair helping of these for your energy acceleration, and they'll get KO'd fairly frequently. For this skeleton, I've put down 2 Mewtwo as the minimum, and even that is going to be hard to get hold of for most players. This card is soaring in price and seems to be staying around the £40 mark over here. Still a lot for a card that you're going to need 2 of in almost any deck. Of course, a third Mewtwo would be nice, and if you can stretch to 3, then go for it. That way you can always have an answer for any other Mewtwo thrown at you. And the last Pokemon in the skeleton is Tornadus, currently sitting at 4 copies simply because this is your main attacker. Many players call this deck Mewtwo Celebi, but it's really Celebi Tornadus, with Mewtwo as a tech since Tornadus hits harder and faster even if it does take 1 more energy to do so. Being able to use Hurricane on the first turn, as many players have found out, can end the game before it's even started. But even if not, that turn 1, 2 and 3 of 80 damage towards your opponent seriously puts the pressure on early, exactly what this deck is supposed to do. And that's it for the Pokemon, short and simple, which is what players like about the deck. No complicated text, no funny tricks, just attach energy and do fast damage. However, there are techs you can include to make it more versatile, which I'll cover later, but first, the trainer and supporter lines. The glaring thing that many players notice is that we don't have any Pokemon collector in here. The reason? Simply because you don't run many Pokemon at all. Whatever you start with isn't really bad, and you only need one heads-on dual ball to get the ball rolling, which makes the deck feel so consistent. If you really aren't a fan of the flips, then you can go ahead and put in 4 collector over the dual ball, but just realise that you may not get the first turn damage as often, since you can't use other supporters such as Juniper to fish for that energy you may need for the turn 180. If you do go down the collector route, then I'll suggest maybe 3 Pokemon collector and a couple of dual ball, which gives you the perks of using dual ball, but gives you something to fall back on if the flips fail you. The supporters we do have in here are very few, but we have lots of them. For example, we have 4 Professor Juniper and 4 Pond, the simplest of draw supporters, but many of them to make sure that we not only start with at least one, but draw into them when using another. You also have space for around 4 other spaces to dedicate to draw supporters, and one which David chose to use in his winning ECC list was 4N. This provided you with the early draw power you needed to get going, but also stomped on decks such as Zekrom Eels in the late game, who need those draw supporters to stay in the game. If you can still swing hard with Tornadus and or Mewtwo in the late game, then play N and watch your opponent struggle to keep up. Any other options could be things like Sage's Training, but you don't really want to be discarding anything crucial too early, especially when you have the likes of Juniper to draw more cards if you do have to discard stuff. Try and keep it as simple as possible, and this deck will do what it needs to do. Onto trainers, and you have a fair bit of room at your disposal to fill with cards that always end up getting cut out in other lists, because they're really nice to have, but don't have the space. However, you do have this luxury, so you can stock up on poker gear to get those supporters if they don't end up flowing nicely enough, 4 Pokemon Capture and 4 Junk Arm to attack wherever you like and reuse every trainer in your deck, 4 Dual Ball in this list was covered earlier, 3 Sky Arrow Bridge make sure that you can retreat for free early on in the game without the aid of your next card, Switch, of which you have 2, to pull off more complex moves allowing for multiple uses of Celebi's Poke Power, and finally we have Eviolite, of which we currently have 2 to sponge damage when you most need it. As for energy, you currently have 10 Grass and 4 double colourless to make sure they're in your starting hand and can continue being placed onto the field with Forest Breath. And that is your complete skeleton list, with space left to fill with some of these ripe candidates. A tech that made it into David's winning list was Shaman from Unleashed, a card that everyone knows by now moves energy on your side of the field when it enters play with Celebration Wind. What this will give you is a little bit more flexibility with your energy attachments, particularly your double colourless, so you can move energy around onto the likes of Mewtwo, which may be needing some extra firepower to take down the opponent's active threat. It pretty much saves you from misplay energy too, if you ever need it in your late game. When running this card, also think of running things like Super Scoop Up to possibly reuse the power later on and help you to pick up heavily damaged Pokemon, which will become a more frequent thing when considering this next tech. Regigigas was quickly presumed to be one of the worst EXs in the new set, but it has been sneaking its way into many decks because it is actually incredibly hard to KO when Eviolite is attached. This makes your opponent take a 2-hit KO on Regigigas, giving you the chance to hit back with Giga Hammer, which gets heavier hitting the more damage Regigigas has obtained. This may give your opponent 2 prizes when getting KO'd, but another unsuspecting EX could take a hit from a heavily damaged EX, giving you the advantage instead. It seems really easy to get around, but when put into the active spot, your opponent is forced to take the Gigas down before it starts mowing down your opponent's attackers. Smeargle is also a nice option in here, a card that's gone much better with the release of Sky Arrow Bridge. Being able to use Portrait and copy any supporter your opponent is holding gives you the upper hand on being able to set up quicker. Juniper isn't always going to be an issue either, since you can actually get away with discarding a fair few things in your deck when you run so many multiples. When this card is in your deck, you may also be able to run a few less supporters in your build, since you will be using your opponent, and running up to 2 could be a good idea to stay as consistent as possible. There are 2 more reasonable Pokemon choices that you can make, and the first is Terrakion. This guy is sticking around as long as lightning types keep sticking at the top tables. Retaliate is the perfect attack to take out any opposing lightning type Pokemon, taking 2 prizes for your trouble when talking about EXs. And that is what Terrakion is really for, and is decent in this deck because you can set it up in one turn, rather than benching it and risking it being captured up before you have a chance to fully utilise it. Of course, this means you're either going to need to use Fighting Energy in place of some Grass, or you could go for Prism Energy since you won't be using anything to attack but basics. Prism Energy is a lot more prone to annoyance because of Loss Remover, but it is a lot more versatile in its uses. However, it cannot be attached via Forest Breath for obvious reasons, and since all of your other attackers run off colourless costs, you should be able to get away with just a couple Fighting Energy in your list. The second Pokemon you can choose is one that players aren't really sold on yet, Shaymin EX. This card is your perfect comeback attacker and can net you your last prize or prizes when knocking out an EX in the late game of a very close game. Revenge Blast can hit up to 180 damage when your opponent only has the 1 prize remaining, but you need to use it wisely to save them taking that last prize off of your weak 110 HP Shaymin. That being said, you should only really use this attack when taking your last prizes, such as KOing a troublesome EX Pokemon on your opponent's side of the field. Not only this, but Shaymin fits in nicely with the Grass energy you already run, so why not give it a go? However, starting with it is something players are certainly aware of, so be very careful when running this, it can easily backfire. The last 2 cards I'm going to cover are Super Scoop Up and Plus Power. Super Scoop Up was mentioned earlier, but is a very nice card in here when utilising Regigigas in particular. Since your Mewtwo's and Tornadus will probably be KO'd in one attack, Super Scoop Up really isn't going to help you out unless you're running Smeargle, but being able to pick up some heavy damage puts you in the driver's seat and your opponent back a whole turn. Sure, it relies on a flip, but if you flip one of those heads, it can tilt the outcome of the entire game. And lastly we have Plus Power, a card that I think is an amazing play in anything you're running at least 2 Mewtwo in. As soon as it's been used, you can tilt a 2 energy X-Ball into a KO on a 2 energy Mewtwo, which your opponent may not see coming, and using it with Junk Arm later on in the game will make sure that you can stay on top of the Mewtwo trade-off. Consider running at least 2 of these in the list if you're struggling against opposing Mewtwo. And that is all you need to know about Celebi Mewtwo Tornadus, a deck that is currently taking the format by storm and should have a decent showing at regionals which are just around the corner. I know I've been talking about this deck a bit in other videos, but I wanted to bring it all together into one video so that you could all have a good grasp of the deck and how to build it. Thanks for watching this week's episode of PokeClass. Make sure you subscribe and please spend a second by clicking the like button just here. I would really appreciate it. See you next week.